Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from the S all the way down to the C tier for patch 12.9. We're fast approaching the end of set 6, and as usual when it's near the end, it's time for a good old fun patch and meta. What's interesting about this patch though is it's actually relatively diverse in terms of viable synergies. This is largely thanks to the free Tome of Traits and Eggs, since it makes a lot of strategies viable. That said, let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Kicking off our tier list, we have the synergies in the S tier, which are Clockwork, Innovator, Enchanter, Socialite, and Scholar Mastermind. Not a whole lot has really changed in terms of what makes these synergies in the S tier. Innovator has snuck back in, but in general, the idea of this tier is splash traits that have consistent use in the meta. The patch solidified these traits in the S tier, with most of them receiving some type of buff, plus being easier to access with the free tome. At the top of the S tier is, once again, Clockwork. Clockwork has remained amazingly consistent throughout set 6, and is ending this set on a high note, as is by far the best splash trait in the meta. Even though they nerfed the upper end of the trait, it has never been a better time to splash into Clockwork, nor has it been easier to play for Clockwork. Synergy is just too useful for most compositions, and it has good champions. One specific champion to talk about is Orianna, who got a ton of buffs this patch, probably making her the best all-around splash champion in the game. Jhin and Zilean are also quite good, which adds even more value to Clockwork. If you haven't already, we definitely recommend getting some Clockwork stocks. Innovator was one of the synergies most affected by the free tome. Being able to easily play 5 or 7 Innovators helps a lot for the trait. At the core of the synergy is one concept: flexibility. Innovators provide the foundation for a lot of meta compositions to be built from, whether that's Socialite Aurelia, Draven, Jhin, Jinx, Jace, and a plethora of other boards. Point being, if you're looking to play flex, the best place is to start with the Innovator trait. Next up is possibly the most played yet underrated splash trait, Enchanter. Enchanter has been a core part of most compositions throughout set 6, but rarely has it been necessary to play more than 2. Once or twice we've seen Enchanter focus boards like Senna Morgana, but for the most part you splash into, call it a day. Then the 12.9 patch attacked and everything changed. By change, we mean they buffed the heck out of Enchanters. Not just the synergy, but several of the units as well. Now we're seeing Enchanters used in all kinds of ways, not just as a splash trait. That said, it's worth noting that Enchanters do best against AP, and AP is struggling compared to AD, so a lot of the time it is business as usual, where players usually only use 2 Enchanters at most on their board. Still, the fact you can play an Enchanter board and do well adds increased value to this synergy. Socialite is roughly the same as usual, though it did receive a buff. In general, this is still a well-rounded splash synergy that pairs especially well with Innovator thanks to Seraphine. Finishing the S tier, we have Scholar and Mastermind. Once again, we're pairing these two synergies together because Silico has a huge presence in the late game, and more often than not, he's played alongside another Scholar. Where Scholars received a decent buff, and we've seen quite a few mid-game Scholar boards do well. Syndra, Zyra, and Kastan are fantastic early game champions with decent scaling, and as mentioned, Silico is a great late game champion. The only loser in all of this is Renata, as the nerfs to Morellonomicon hurt her the most out of basically any other champion in the meta. Renata aside, Scholars, and by proxy Mastermind, are still both top tier splash traits. Let's now move on to the A tier, which consists of the Synergy Striker, Mutant, Transformer, Bodyguard, Rival, Sniper, Syndicate, Scrap, and Arcanist. These are the most commonly used main synergies of the meta, and most of them got a lot better thanks to the free tome and the various buffs 12.9 brought with it. Somewhat controversially, we have Strikers at the top of the A tier, mainly because they don't do poorly against anything and are especially good against Enchanters. Sivir was nerfed, but offsetting that nerf was a decent buff to Aurelia, so Striker boards are at an equilibrium between the two carries. Sivir may be weaker, but is still the unit that uses Last Whisper the best, which is a key to burning through front lines like Bodyguard. Being able to easily hit 6 Strikers thanks to the Tome of Traits on top of the Aurelia buffs has helped keep Strikers not only relevant, but has helped them to thrive. Mutant is another synergy that benefits greatly from having an emblem to use from the Tome. Whether that's with Synaptic Web, Voracious, or another mutation, being able to flex in other champions and synergies alongside those mutations helps a lot. That said, AP boards are struggling, so don't expect a free win just because you have 7 mutants with Synaptic Web. Kha'Zix is also a bit weaker overall, though his mid-game is still great. All in all, this synergy is still as consistent and strong as it was before 12.9. Of course, Transformer is lurking near the top of the A tier since Innovators are in the S tier. Jace is as good as he's ever been, and there's not much need to talk about in regards to him. Bodyguards are the undisputed winners of the frontline wars in this patch, as added armor is absolutely necessary against all the AD boards in the current meta. Braum and Leona are staples for a lot of compositions, especially Braum because of his CC. There's also the possibility of playing the fabled 8 Bodyguard board, which we saw how effective it was during Worlds. Basically, if you need frontline, use some Bodyguards. We're on the fence regarding Rival because Bruisers are lower in priority this patch, meaning Vi is as well. But we can't ignore how strong Jinx is as a late game carry, and that's mainly what saved the Synergy from being lower on the list. Whoa, is that the Sniper trait up in the A tier? Yes, it is. We're often harsh on the Sniper Synergy because, honestly, most of the time 2 Sniper buff is a bit underwhelming. That's different now that everyone gets a free tome because it's significantly easier to play multiple Snipers. Plus, Ashe, Jhin, and Zeri are all viable carries in the meta, with Caitlyn doing well in the early game. Sniper is definitely one of the big winners of this patch. Similarly, Syndicate has had a real glow up this patch thanks to Ashe reroll. That said, it does look a bit odd having Syndicate in the A tier when 7 Syndicate was nerfed. There are 2 reasons we've bumped it up so high on the list. 1, it's a lot easier to play 5 or 7 Syndicate boards with a free tome. 2, Renata being out of the meta means off-meta AD carries like Ashe can do well, and Ashe is a good champion into other AD boards. There's a few more minor reasons, but the point is Syndicate stocks are way up this patch. Scrap is as scrappy as ever and is a common synergy for several meta compositions like Strikers and Innovators. Overall, a useful synergy that got better with the tome. Rounding out the A tier, we have Arcanists. We debated putting Arcanist lower because AP is struggling right now, but once again, the Tome trait swoops in to help it out. Being able to flex in more champions or hit the higher tiers of Arcanist are incredibly important for keeping Arcanist afloat in the meta. They may not be the strongest, but as far as AP boards go, they are one of the few that remains consistent. With that, we continue into the B tier, which consists of the Synergies Debonair, Bruiser, Glutton, Yordle, Mercenary, Enforcer, Twinshot, Chemtech, and Assassin. Basically, these synergies are played depending on the circumstances or as companions to the more meta synergies in the A tier. Debonair kicks off the B tier thanks to Draven, though Syndra, Leona, and Zeri are all useful champions. Draven has finally made it into the big leagues of the meta as a well-rounded AD carry that can be played in multiple compositions. But you do need VIP on him, and because of that, Debonair, which artificially increases the value of the synergy. As mentioned earlier, Bruisers are struggling a bit in the meta, which has a lot to do with Renata, but also the lack of defensive stats does hurt a lot. Armor or magic resist just scales better than health, so beyond the early game, there isn't much of a reason to use Bruisers as your frontline compared to Bodyguards. Following Bruisers is, of course, Glutton. Tahm Kench still has the same strengths and weaknesses as he's had for, well, most of the mid-set. Fantastic if you find him earlier, weaker in the late game if you haven't had time for him to scale. It's a bit difficult to fit him on the board with Bruisers being less common. Because Yordles don't have an emblem at all, they don't really benefit from the new egg mechanic. Overall, nothing is new for Yordles, as they are still amazing in the early game for building econ and then fall into the void afterwards. Oddly enough, Mercenaries didn't gain a lot from the 12.9 patch. If anything, it got a bit weaker because they don't have much of a power swing as it previously did. With so many things in 12.9 patch being buffed, the balance is all over the place and huge swings can often happen without a Mercenary at all. In addition to that, it's rare that the egg will pop in the early game and even more rare that the tome will be a Mercenary emblem, so it's not even easier to play Mercs. At the end of the day, Mercenaries are still viable if you have them active on 2-1, but be careful getting baited into them beyond that point. Enforcer has actually gone up in value thanks to the egg and the tome, as it's easier to play 3 Enforcers. Additionally, they put in a second tier of Enforcers, so in rare instances, there's a way to use 5 Enforcers as your main synergy. That said, Enforcers are still less valuable on average than a lot of other traits, especially compared to the other splash traits. Much like Yordle's Twinshot does not have an emblem to use, so it misses out on all the free trait shenanigans going on. As we said in the past, Twinshot lives or dies on the augments of the game, so it can be near the top of the A tier in power with things like Sharpshooter, or basically C tier with no useful augments. We also think it's a missed opportunity to not add in a Twinshot emblem for this patch, since it would have really added in chaos and fun to the meta. Chemtech is sad tech because Renata got weaker and Tryndamere just isn't as good as a late game carry. There's still ways to play Chemtech, especially in the early game, but overall, this synergy is struggling. And to end this tier, we have Assassin. Assassin doesn't really benefit at all from the egg and tome because no one really ever plays more than 2 or 4 Assassins. Kha'Zix is still doing well in the mid game, but that's thanks to Mutants. Talon reroll is somewhere on the fringe of the meta, but again, it's not an Assassin-focused board. There's definitely a place for Assassins in the meta, but the trait itself is a bit lacking. And at the bottom of the tier list is, of course, the C tier. This tier consists of the synergies Hextech, Challenger, Colossus, and Yordle Lord. While we do see some of these traits used, the fact is they just don't do nearly enough compared to the tiers above them. Hextech is down to the C tier primarily because Striker is just the better trait for Sivir. There's also the fact that Hextech bonus damage is magic and not enough to overcome the magic defenses of Enchanter. Point is that even though Hextech should be better in this patch, it sadly is not because Sivir only does well with Strikers, Lucian with Twinshot Arcanist, and Swain with Arcanist. Basically, after the early game, it's an unnecessary synergy. Even though Draven is doing well, Challenger as a whole is not. The main reason Challenger is just not worth it is that Clockwork does a similar job with fewer and better champions. Clockwork essentially makes Challenger obsolete. Sag. In the outer reaches of the meta, there may exist a 3 Colossus composition, but in general, Colossus is just not a synergy you focus on at all. The units have to be way more impactful to take up multiple slots on the board, like, say, a massive 10-cost dragon. Sadly, that's not the reality for Colossus in Set 6, making it one of the more underwhelming synergies. And at the bottom of the barrel, as always, is Yordle Lord. Honestly, now is the time to play this trait because the patch is all about having fun with the meta, and nothing is more fun, or more of a meme, than Yordle Lord. That's all for today's tier list video. All in all, despite the crazy changes of this patch, the meta is actually in a decent spot. We wish you good luck on your climb as we're quickly reaching the end of Set 6. Let us know in the comment section below what synergies you've been having the most success with. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, future Giant Slayer TFT videos.